Hello, my name is Sister MaryAnne, and I'm here to have a conversation with you about a book that I think is very pertinent to today. The title of the book is Beyond Tolerance, Searching for Interfaith Understanding in America by Gustav Niebuhr. I chose this book as a possible jumping off point for a conversation because I think it's timeless. I think the topic is timeless, especially now as we really continue to navigate how to be in relationship with those different than ourselves. Now, I don't know what your experience is, but often I do not pay too much attention to the preface or the introduction to the book unless something catches my eye. In this case, I'm going to spend quite a bit of time with you walking through, actually, both the preface and the introduction, because they set the tone, they set the framework for the rest of the book. And then I'm going to give you less of myself and more questions so that you can continue that conversation on your own. So let me talk a little bit about why this introduction is important. I don't know if you've ever tried to have a conversation about religion or that type of a thing with another, with even a friend or with family members. Often we just kind of close down and tighten up. We have a tendency to get a bit anxious about it. Well, that's because I think it's really important that when we get in these conversations about things that are very close to us, that we really realize we bring ourselves to that. Whatever is intimate about religion or faith involves our whole person, our whole being, the context, the culture from which we have grown up, as well as our faith experience. Those two things form the lens through which we look at, hear, and can move and navigate, I think, this topic. And that's what I think Gustav presents so well with regard to himself. It allows us to understand why he took on this book, why he got engaged in these conversations, why he thinks it's important, and what he hopes it will bring us to in this rather difficult period in our world. And so let me give you a little bit of a background from where out of which he comes. What is his lens? What is his context? A lot stems from his great-grandmother, Lydia. Now, Lydia comes from Protestant background. Her father was a Protestant minister. She married a Protestant minister. She had sons who became rather famous theologians. So she was steeped herself in religion and in faith, and it was second nature to her. But there was something very interesting about how she navigated her own faith and her own prayer life. It had a particularly Catholic dimension to it. And what do I mean by that? I mean the small c Catholic, something that's universal, widespread, and that is very large in its the arms that it wraps around. And so she gathered from many denominations her prayers: the Quakers, the Puritans, the Greek Orthodox, Roman Catholics. She loved Cardinal Newman, great Baptist minister Walter Washenbush, who was an exponent of the social gospel. She drew on litanies. She loved the prayer of St. Francis. She had a very Catholic or universal approach. And that was foundational to her lens. Her husband, Gustav Niebuhr, had a conversion experience during his life as a minister. And he was sort of taken aback by the division between more progressive Protestants, of which he came from, and some of those in the Lutheran community. And he really believed that this type of division and separateness was problematic because they were all about the same message. And while he didn't try to bring people to his perspective or point of view, what he wanted to do is to bring people together in common conversation so that they could move forward about what they needed to do. Again, this is a person who shaped the life of the current Gustav Niebuhr, who wrote the book in the 20th century. Others of his relatives who were very famous was Richard Niebuhr and his great-uncle Reinhold Niebuhr, both who taught at very famous universities. And this book then emerges from the richness that comes from their experience. And as you look through that introduction, I'm leaving some of the parts of the story out so that you can discover some of those experiences for yourself in that preface. So these were instrumental people that shaped the context, created the lens, and formed Gustav's own faith experience. In his introduction, called On Doubt and Conversion, he begins to talk about people that he became involved with who brought to his attention the importance of thinking about how do we come together with people not only of cultural difference, but of religious difference. And what might that mean for our future? Little did he know how important this would be as time moved on. So he relates this particular story at the very beginning. In 1993, William Swing was the Episcopal bishop of the Diocese of California, and he resided in the San Francisco region. And it was the 50th anniversary of the founding of the United Nations, and he was presiding at that beautiful Grace Cathedral, which some of you may know about. And an official came to him and said, "I'd like you to be one of the participants in the celebration." And here was the official's idea. He wanted to bring the 200 nations that were part of the United Nations together with representatives from all the world's religions for the purpose of having an event that emphasizes peace and unity. Because in his mind, in this official's mind, that was really the complete message, bringing nations and religion together to reflect on peace and unity. Now, Bishop Swing got to thinking. There were about 40 wars going on in the world at that time. And while religion, he would not say, caused the wars, it fueled the wars. And so he really got to thinking about this to a great extent. He thought, what is this official trying to say to me, and what is the bigger ramification of this if I say yes? Well, he decided to take the gamble. And he called it his conversion to learning how we're going to live together in a bigger context than his own. And so Gustav goes on to talk about how that started to unfold and how that incident got him to thinking about how are we going to be working with each other as time moves on. Now, he also goes on to talk about what this book is not about, and I'm not going to talk to you about that. I'll let you discover that for yourself. I want to kind of jump to the thesis then. And I think it's extremely important to understand where his thesis, I think, of the book really came from. And I'm quoting him and also the person that he gained inspiration from. Ironically, Gustav says, the book that influenced him was one that happens to be neatly identified as a book about religious terror. It was written by a sociologist by the name of Mark Juergensmeyer. And at one point, Juergensmeyer writes this, and I quote from him, "It is difficult to belittle and to kill a person whom one knows and from whom one has no personal antipathy. Now, the key phrases for Niebuhr were whom one knows and no personal antipathy. 6 words that, as Niebuhr says, point toward a markedly different type of interaction among people in a world in which violence seems so dominant. And he goes on further to say, what interests me in writing this book is the idea that some people choose to build networks that deliberately cross boundaries in an era in which religious differences are so explosive. And he calls it a quiet counter-trend. A quiet counter-trend. So, thematically, I would say that is really an essential idea for him. He will now be in pursuit of this quiet counter-trend. So the book then is based on visits and conversations with people involved in this process. And what he points out is not all of these people are celebrities, though there are marvelous ones, and not all of them gain a lot of attention. But he was very taken with the number of people doing this under the radar, as he expressed it. And he wanted to know why and what they're really up to. And could this even make a difference? So again, in this introduction, you can read for yourselves about all the different people he names, everybody from Mahatma Gandhi to Dorothy Day to Malcolm X after his own conversion, and so on and so on. And so he looks at those, and then he looks at people of a lesser status, because those are the individuals that influenced these unnotables moving forward. And he talks about what is similar. What is it about the one that encouraged the other? And I think you'll find that very interesting. He also centers on this concept coming from Martin Luther King. And it kind of builds on William Swing and his own grandfather's experience and everything else. King says this in his pursuit of civil rights: we're caught in an inescapable network of mutuality. We're caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. And this is the question I would raise. Is this a belief that you would hold? This was pivotal to Gustav Niebuhr as he wrote this book, this concept. What does this statement really say to you? Now, the project of this book came a little after 9/11, but Gustav says this was not as a response to the terrorist attacks. His interest in this other idea, which is counterintuitive, is that religious differences might be used as a basis for forging peace rather than inspiring hatred. So now we've got the counter trend of moving together with people who are different to explore what might be common. And then you have the fact that possibly religious differences, because they offer us different perspectives, I would wager would be his theory, might be able to help us forge peace. Because sometimes once you figure out what is at the basis of a real difference, you can find a common point of consensus that moves people forward. And that would be what I would wager his thought would be. So now we've got the counter trend and this counterintuitive notion. And, this came because he spent 20 years as a journalist, and that was his background, not theology. He spent 20 years as a journalist reporting on religion interestingly. So when 9/11 came, he already had about 20 years of background engaging in these trends and in these insights that he thought were emerging. Part of this happened because he ran into so much different religious landscape as he did his reporting as a journalist. And again, I'm going to let you discover what that landscape looked like. But to just whet your appetite a bit, there were large Baptist communities, which, in Georgia, had only the Baptist community with which to contend. And all of a sudden, Georgia is having many more Catholics, many more people of other denominations, and those who are not Christian at all in their landscape. People like Diana Eck from the Harvard Project, the Pluralism Project, were gathering data that also expressed the difference across the landscape of America. So his discoveries 20 years before only helped to energize him moving forward on this topic after the tremendous incidences that occurred because of 9/11. And you, as I said, can look at those experiences which he details in the introduction. He also goes at this from about 5 different points of view, and I'm just going to touch on a couple of them. He says that there's a lot of signs of hope among people doing this very same thing. Instead of being adversarial, they are seeing difference as being strengthening. And he calls this radical because it's the radical thing. It goes against tribalism, gathering and being with your own, and not being able to look at or incorporate or have conversation with anyone who is different than yourself. So again, he layers this kind of radical ability to talk with another from a non-adversarial position as something, again, that is just augmenting his discoveries about these people working under the radar, those in the counter trend, those who are using the counterintuitive approach to coming together. And this is going to be a bit controversial, and I'll want you to explore this in depth because he really takes a lot of time to say, could some of this hopeful behavior be an interesting response to the language, and he goes into great detail about this, the language of the war on terrorism. Let me just quote directly from the book on this because I would want you to have this context, and then be sure to take a look at this in depth yourself. He says, no rational person can fail to take seriously the deadly exchange raised by groups like bin Laden's Al-Qaeda, and of course we would add ISIS to this, which mix religion and politics for the purpose of wholesale destruction. But the efficacy of fear has its limits. And the idea of a war against terror works only so far as it is possible to regard humanity as existing utterly without nuance, divided with stark permanence into 2 warring camps. Us versus them till time's end. Now go back to counter-trend, counterintuitive, radical approach. Let's talk, though we're very different. And he says this, war must never replace or exclude either efforts to construct a civil society. And he draws on Franklin Delano Roosevelt's 4 Freedoms talk that he gave before we were brought into the Second World War. And Roosevelt said this in summary: that one must lift up the ideals of freedom of speech and of worship, along with freedom from want and freedom from fear. This offered a vision of community amidst violence, a vision that implicitly included a respect for religious diversity. This was the attitude with what one who was an American was to go forward in war. The discovery of common interests, which lies at the heart of democracy, cannot be forced by polarization, especially when religious differences are involved. Societies are nurtured through people willing to claim as a role, as citizens, working together. So, going into an understanding of the nature of the book itself, the title of the book, this is then beyond tolerance. Because when you tolerate someone, you just say, well, let's let them be and live over there. I don't make any effort to discover what your living is about, or what makes you tick, or what your concerns or interests are. And that's why in this conversation, Gustav draws us into, let's move beyond that. And this will take some of those things that I've already cited that he thought were so important. This counter-trend and counterintuitiveness and so forth in approaching reality. He goes on to explain this in great depth. He goes back and speaks again to his own personal understanding, why he got drawn into this as he left professional journalism, where he had to remain very unbiased in his approach, not to become sectarian or to become biased, but to engage in a different kind of conversation in pursuit of these particular ideas that he had brought forth. And he said, some people will doubt this. Some people will read this book and say, well, I don't know if that's going to work. And that's okay. He cites Thomas Merton, who said, if anybody doesn't doubt what they're about, they probably will never grow in their own depth of faith. So there's doubt attached to this kind of approach, but there's also enough evidence to say, in places where it's been tried and in those areas where it has surfaced as an approach to coming together, even though one has differences, the fruit has been very positive. And what he says is the unfortunate thing is these are the stories that are unsung. These are the stories that we do not know about. Now, what would I say to you as you move along in this? And again, he goes into great detail about this. This is what I would say. Engage each of these ideas through your own lens, cultural and religious. See what you agree with. See what provides a bit of tension for you. See what your own response would be. And take in your own experiences. I would wager that many of you out there have dealt with diversity, difference, and so forth. And I'm sure that you would have evidence to back up what is the most successful result. I'm sure you would come to the conclusion that probably it was when we have that dialogue, that discussion that might be uncomfortable and yet leads to better understanding and better insight. So I would ask you to engage in that dialogue with yourself and then think about this last sentence that he talks about, this, and it's a phrase in his last sentence in this introduction. And it goes back to William Swing. It goes back to a lot of the material that I've already shared with you. He raises this idea that are we not much richer and much better off as persons when we have a conversion to another person? It doesn't mean that we take on their beliefs. It doesn't mean that we become one with them culturally. Maybe we can't because we're of a different background. but it's a conversion to the other, going back to what Swing talked about. Can we learn how to converse, be with each other in our differences to move to something greater? And would we look different if we came together in terms of nations and religion with that kind of intention in mind?